Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, Ohio Air Quality Permitting and Compliance Basics, presented by Civil and Environmental Consultants, Inc. My name is Pamela, and I will be the web organizer for today. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to go over a few housekeeping items. We want to make sure today's presentation is extremely valuable for you, so we ask that you submit all questions by clicking on the question button in the control panel and typing your question. Right now, please welcome me in joining our speakers. Sarah Buzis has worked with the Cleveland Division of Air Quality, Ohio EPA, for the past 9 years as both an environmental compliance specialist and in the capacity of permit review manager. Jim Cooper has over 20 years of experience working in air quality, including 5 years in source testing, 5 years in air quality consulting, and 10 years working in the oil and gas industry in a variety of capacities. He has spent the biggest part of the last decade as an industry liaison to local and federal trade associations, where he worked diligently to affect change and mitigate impacts to industry as a result of unfavorable regulatory actions. Without further ado, I'm going to turn the presentation over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Pamela. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Just to put a finer point on it, Sarah is, she was with Ohio EPA Cleveland Division of Air Pollution Control, or Air Quality Control. She's now with Assistant Project Manager with CEC. I am also, I'm the office lead, the Cleveland office lead for Civil and Environmental Consultants, and I'm also a principal in the air group. So I kind of wear two hats. But we'll go ahead and get started the way we're going to do it today. This is just kind of like an Air 101 primer, kind of Ohio specific and manufacturing specific. We're not going to get too far into the weeds on any of the federal regs. We will take a little bit of a deeper dive into state regs, but there's just we're time limited, and so we're not gonna. This isn't going to be the day that we really put everyone to sleep with pouring through federal regulations. So I'm going to take the first, I think, 18 slides or so, just kind of an introductory thing on permitting process and then or the types of permits that are out there, and then Sarah's going to jump in and she's going to finish it up and get into the actual application process, what you do after you get your permit, and I think we have a slide or two on compliance as well. So just the table of contents. These are generally the things we're going to be talking about today. Air permitting program in Ohio, types of permits, the process, like I said, and then we'll get into some regulatory stuff. Compliance. There's our pictures. Pamela did the introduction, so I don't have to do that again. And here are, if you have any of these things, these are the things that this is not an inclusive list, obviously, but these are some examples of things that would possibly trigger permitting in the manufacturing industry, any of these sources. One of them that's not on here, that's an easy one to forget, is emergency generators. It's so easy to forget that I actually forgot to put it in the presentation. We get that one a lot. People don't realize they have to, or potentially have to, permit their emergency generators. So if you have any of those, make sure you get those checked out as well. Some other examples of just gaseous emission sources in the manufacturing industry. You guys will get, everyone will get this. I think this is going to be sent out to everybody at the end. And here's a map. If nobody's seen it, this is kind of how the state breaks up their the air quality districts. Obviously, we're in Northeast Ohio. The Northeast District office, I believe, is, I want to say it's in Twinsburg. Sarah, is that where it's at?
Yep. Yeah. It's in Twinsburg.
And also, even if we're going to break it down, even further than that, there's the local office, the Cleveland office, that's kind of a contractor for the state that Sarah worked for. But here's just kind of a description of what these district offices do. And this, not all of this is really air quality specific, but they do other things besides air. Obviously, they're going to review applications. If somebody calls in with a complaint, they're going to be the ones boots on the ground to go out and look at it and see what's going on. Compliance monitoring, providing technical assistance to the regulated community. If there's any enforcement action that they feel is necessary, a lot of it will be initiated regionally, and providing information assistance to the public, and they'll coordinate the public records requests as well. So if anybody wants to do a FOIA, they'll do it through their regional office. Also, there's additional permitting that, if you have a facility that may need to be done or considered beyond just the air quality stuff, different city permits, county permits, and other state permits as well. So, and under the city permits, you see the local air permitting program. That's the Cleveland Division of Air Quality, which Sarah worked for under the Department of Public Health. They were, it's not, I won't say it's common. It's such a bigger metropolitan area, though, that it was made sense for Ohio EPA to kind of carve that out and to have that local office. So I'm sure if any of you have operations downtown or within their jurisdiction, you're dealing with the local Cleveland office rather than the Twinsburg office. And obviously there's many different types of authorizations or permits, whatever you want to call them. It's hard to have an emission source anymore without having to get some sort of authorization for it. There are certain sources that are determined to be exempt according to the first bullet here. They're listed in there. Such minor sources, such minor environmental concerns or air quality concerns that they are actually just completely exempt from anything. This list gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and there aren't many sources, especially in the manufacturing industry, that are just going to be exempt. But there are some, and it's worth checking out that the reference there for the rule. Then you have kind of your next the next one up on the food chain. There would be a permit by rule. There aren't many of these either. It's not an exemption. All it really does is allows you to get authorization and get an actual state permit without going through the permit to install and operate process, which, for minor sources or synthetic miners can be, it's fairly lengthy anyway. So I know there's like gasoline dispensing facilities is one, auto body shops, things like that. They actually have permit by rule. And yeah, the way that kind of works is if you have a new facility that's never been permitted and you're going to get a PBR, you're just going to submit that. And once you have confirmation of receipt of the PBR application, then you are authorized to operate that facility. If you have an existing permit, say a PTIO, and something has happened to that where you now qualify for the PBR and you want to get away from your existing permit, you can do that as well. And as soon as your original permit has been, you get notice that it has been revoked. Once it has been revoked, then you're authorized to operate under the PBR. So those ones are fairly simple. Like I said, there aren't many out there anymore, but there are a few under consideration as well. And they're working on some, so there might be a few more in the future, but I think there's only about 4 or 5 that are out there right now, and they may be considering another 4 or 5, so not many. General permits, there's several of these, and the difference between a general permit and a regular permit is you can't tailor these to fit your operation. The general permit is they're going to do all of the calculations, they're going to do all the legwork up front. When I say they, I mean Ohio EPA. They're going to develop this permit, and all you're going to do once it's the general permit that they come up with has been It's went out for public comment, it's been approved, and it's actually out there for use. You're going to answer some questions. There's going to be a qualifying criteria document. You're literally going to go down and it's going to be a checklist. Do you meet this? Yes, no. Do you meet this requirement? Yes or no. And there are operational restrictions, horsepower restrictions for engines, throughput type restrictions, things like that. Where if you have those certain pieces of equipment and they're rated a certain way, they know you're not going to exceed the emission limits that they're trying to keep you under. So general permit is all you're really doing is applying for authorization under an existing general permit. So you don't have to go through all of the application forms, and you don't even have to do go through the lengthy, well, you have to do the calculations, but you're not submitting all of that stuff. So it's a much more streamlined process. You get these authorizations back really quickly, sometimes within, I've heard them coming back within a week or two. I don't know that there's many out there that are for the manufacturing industry, but there are plenty of general permits in the state. And if you can use them, I recommend it. They're pretty plug and play. And like I said, the turnaround is quick. No comment period with those. It's already been taken care of at the beginning, so that's always nice. So that's it for those. I guess and then the next level up is you have
Sarah, before you go on, can I ask a question? I have
Sure.
an attendee question here, and the question is, how do you find out which permits you need?
How do you find out?
Right.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Basically what it's going to be is, and we do have slides on that. It's going to be, it's going to depend on where you're located, whether or not you're in an attainment or a non-attainment area, or it'll depend on your emissions. There are certain emission thresholds that determine what sort of permit that you are eligible for. And on the general permit side, the way you see, my background, a lot of it is, I spent a lot of years doing oil and gas. They have a general permit out there, 12.1 and 12.2, that applies to the oil and gas production industry. And they also have general permits for the midstream side of oil and gas operations. So really when you're doing that, making that determination, you're just going through their list of general permits and seeing if there's one that fits your facility. And then you go through that qualifying criteria document to see if you comply or you can comply with the requirements that are in there. And then, like I said, a lot of it is determined by the amount of emissions that your facility has. So, and then I guess probably the real easy self-serving answer is call me and I'll tell you which one you need.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Well, and like I said, we have more slides and we'll talk more about that, how we determine which permits apply here a little bit later. The next one is minor source. What was that? Was there a question?
Nope, I said thanks. I'm just logging off so you can continue.
Okay. The next one would be a minor source permit to install and operate. This is kind of your next level up, the next most restrictive one beyond a general permit. It is a true minor source. So what I mean by that, I'll explain that more on the next slide. I won't say insignificant, but you're going to have, these are your lower emitting facilities. In other words, you don't have to put any controls on your sources to reduce emissions. They are low enough on their own to be able to qualify for a true minor permit. And I don't know if, Sarah, do you know when they switched to, they used to break this up where it was a 2-permit process where you would get the permit to install, and then later on you had to apply for a permit to operate. So you had to actually get 2 permits. Now the Ohio has since streamlined that, and they've combined the 2. So now it's just 1 permit to install and operate. How long has that been in place, Sarah?
I want to say that took place in around between 2006 and 2008. It's right around that time frame.
Okay. A little longer ago than I thought, but so now it's a much better process. It's much easier for these for the minor sources and for the for your synthetic miners. But your minor sources you're building a new facility. This is what if you have a new facility with relatively low emissions, you're not triggering major source threshold, or you're not trying to restrict the emissions such as you would with a synthetic miner. This is going to be the permit that you're going to use. Or if you have an existing facility that currently doesn't have an air permit, you're modifying that facility, or some sort of a operational change has happened that now you need a permit, say you're no longer exempt, or you can't use the general permit anymore because something has changed and you have to get something that's a little more customizable, you'll go to this PTIO process. And right here, it says right here, it's going to depend on the type of facility and operation and equipment and emission sources, the size of them, emission levels, and the location. As I mentioned, the location is going to be key if you're dealing with non-attainment area versus attainment area, and we'll talk a little more about that too. You're going to have to do your emission calculations. For this one, they're going to help determine if a permit is required, and if so, which one is required. And also, this application process is going to help you determine as you go through what federal and state or local authorities you're going to have to be dealing with. And most of the stuff that we're talking about here is going to be, you're going to be dealing with the state. Even if there are federal requirements, the state of Ohio has delegation over those, so you'll be satisfying your federal requirements by satisfying the state requirements, if that makes any sense. So, and these permits they're good for 10 years. Okay, skipping ahead to the synthetic miner, or the federally enforceable permit to install and operate. This is what I had kind of mentioned earlier. So you have a facility that, and this will all be clear, we have some slides that show tables with the emission limits and what triggers Title V. Title V is your over 100 tons, if you're in a attainment area, over 100 tons of criteria pollutants, SO2, NOx, particulate matter, VOCs, things like that. And if you are over those, but you don't want to get a Title V permit, what you can do is you can artificially reduce your emissions by installing control equipment, and then you can get a synthetic miner permit, which means it's not really a miner source, but you're going to do things, you're going to have operational restrictions, or you're going to put control equipment on that's going to synthetically make that major source a miner source. So you don't have to go through all of the headaches and jump through all the hoops and all the reporting and the record keeping, all the compliance activities that come with the Title V permit. These are pretty common. The technology is such that you can, as long as it's nothing crazy, you can reduce your emissions out of those Title V levels for most sources pretty easily anymore. So next bullet says kind of just what I had said there. A lot of people use this just to stay out of Title V and avoid some federal rule applicability. These are federally enforceable permits. Your states, you're gonna get them through the states, though. They're gonna have delegation over these, and they're gonna be the ones that you're working with on your Title V's for the most part. You have additional monitoring and record keeping responsibilities with these because, like I said, you're going to have control equipment on site, and anytime you have control equipment on site, you are much more under a microscope than you would be for a true miner facility. These say and the reason is if something happens operationally, or if something breaks or malfunctions on your control equipment, then all of a sudden now you are actually emitting much more than you should, and you could trip over that minor source threshold into the major source. So, and these permits are good for 5 years. We'll talk a little bit about renewals and modifications here, and then we'll jump into the Title V stuff, and maybe that'll kind of tie all this together. Minor source renewals. This is, you have your 10-year minor source permits. The expiration date is 10 years from issuance. You're going to deal with these for existing air permits, and when you have to do the renewals, you're just going to make sure that nothing has changed to change your permit applicability, and make sure there's no increase in emissions for these. And these are also going to be good for 10 years. So once you get your renewal, it's going to be good for another 10 years before you have to do it, providing you don't go through and make any changes or modify the facility that in such a way that triggers a modification. That's all you will have to do, is just go through your renewal. Pretty painless process. Administrative modifications, not a renewal, but something has changed. But in this case, the administrative mods these are just usually minor clerical errors or clarification, something that needs to be changed. There's no increase in emissions with these, and you're not going to have to go through and look at your calculations again and reevaluate your emissions. You're not going to have to go through and re-examine or look at your rule applicability and see if anything changed there. It's just going to be, really just kind of very minor, word changes or things like that don't really affect the operation of the facility or the emissions in any way. When you do this, it doesn't change your permitting time frame, so you still have to abide by the original 10-year limit. It doesn't restart that clock, so if your permit's good for 10 years, you're going to have whatever's remaining on that after you do the modification is still going to be there. It doesn't start over when you do an administrative modification. And the Chapter 31 modifications, these are the modifications for the PTIO process when you have more of a major change that's going to cause, there's going to be operational changes, equipment changes, change in the emissions. It's going to reestablish your best available technology. They're going to redo the calculations. We're going to redo the calculations to reestablish the best available technology for that source or sources. And so this one's going to take a little bit more. Anytime you have your emissions changing, it's going to come under a little more scrutiny. It's going to take longer. And so you're going to look at the emission calculations on these. So if you have a facility that's already permitted and you want to add, I mentioned emergency generators, or say you want to increase production on a line, you want to double it from what it was before, and you're going to have changes that are going to significantly increase your emissions, you're going to have to go through this process if you have a PTIO. So you're going to look at your emission calculations again. You're going to do those over and see what your increases are, and those are going to be included in this. And you're going to go and you're going to look at rule applicability. If you put a new source in, it may be subject to something else that maybe your permit didn't cover before, and now you've got a new rule that you have to comply with, and you have a lot of stuff you have to do on the back end as far as record keeping, reporting, stuff like that. And this one here, it does not restart the permitting clock either, so your permit is still going to expire 10 years from the original permit date, or 5 years depending on what it is. And you're going to have to pay your normal permitting fees for this one as well. So cost you a little money for the Chapter 31 modification. Okay, major sources. This is the Title V. These are kind of the big ones. This was the changes that were made in the amendments to the Clean Air Act of 1990. And these are your bigger facilities. They're more complicated. There's more emission sources at these facilities. Typically, there's more emissions. As I mentioned earlier, for your criteria pollutants, 100 tons per year. If you go over this for PM10, nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, VOCs, and lead, 100 tons is going to be your that's your trigger. If you're under that, you don't have to get the Title V. If you're over, you do. For hazardous air pollutants, such as like benzene and toluene and things like that, 10 tons per year for individual HAP is your trigger, and 25 tons per year aggregate. So if you have several different HAPs that your operation emits, you have to lump all those together to see if they are, the emissions of all of those aggregated together are greater than 25 tons. If they are, you're triggering a Title V. And this is where, like I said, and just to back up to kind of try to tie it all together, the synthetic minor permits, that's where, say you're over, you have 110 tons of sulfur dioxide coming from some unit. And you're like, well, I really don't want to get a Title V permit. Is there anything I can do to reduce that down below 100 tons so I can just get a synthetic minor permit? And maybe you can find a scrubber for that piece of equipment or something to cut those sulfur dioxide emissions down. That would be an example of a synthetic minor. So you're artificially kind of reducing your emissions, even though the facility has the potential to emit emissions greater than the Title V threshold, you're artificially reducing them below by either operational restrictions or putting control devices on, so you can get those easier to live with permits. Hope that makes sense. These Title V permits, they often trigger federal rule applicability. Yeah, either new source performance standards or NESHAP. The NESHAP one is the one reference here, the 40 CFR Part 63. That's your kind of your hazardous air pollutant rules and things like that are in there. So a lot of federal rules start to come into play when you have bigger facilities, as you would imagine. And this is a two-part process in Ohio. It's kind of like I mentioned, the PTIO that Ohio used to have, where it was two parts, and now they've just streamlined it into one. This is actually the kind of the way the PTIO used to be in Ohio. So you have to get your permit to install. That allows you to build your facility, and then you have to get your Title V operating permit, which allows you to actually operate that facility once built. So, and these are good for 5 years. And I'll say this about the Title V's. They're quite a bit more complicated. They're not PSD level or anything like that, but these are quite a bit more complicated. So if you have a Title V permit, or you're thinking about getting a Title V permit for a facility, that 5 years is a little misleading, because you have to start your renewal process a good 6 months prior to the expiration of your permit. It's going to take us that long to kind of figure out what we're doing and what you want, and make sure everything is okay, and get the application put together. There could be meetings with Ohio EPA, planning meetings about what we're doing, if there's been any changes made. And so it just takes a little bit longer. And the regulating agencies, Ohio's going to want, they're going to want that application in hand about 6 months, as I said, about 6 months in advance. So they have plenty of time to review it, and that way it doesn't expire. The permit, the existing permit you have, doesn't expire before they can get done reviewing the renewal and get that into effect. So we probably, a consulting firm, or if you're using a consulting firm, you're going to have to start planning this at least, I'd say, a year in advance, maybe more, because it's going to take some time to pull all of the information together and to put the application together, and then get it submitted 6 months prior to your expiration date. So it's, the 5 years can be a little misleading. You don't really have 5 years to plan. You're going to have to, once you hit that 4-year mark, you better have a consultant on the hook for helping you out with that, unless, of course, you have an air group in-house and you're doing it in-house. For these on the compliance side, kind of sprinkled in some compliance stuff here on the permitting part, but you have a compliance certification that's necessary, and you have more extensive monitoring and record keeping and fees associated with Title V permits and bigger facilities, and could potentially be subject to more inspections. You're just under much more scrutiny when you have a facility that has the potential to emit things over that Title V, over that major source threshold. So you're going to do annual compliance certifications, and you're going to have semi-annual deviation reports that are due with these. So, and I think we talk a little bit more about that at the end. So a lot of moving parts with the Title V permits. I always try to tell people, if you can avoid it, that you want to stay out of Title V. Sometimes you can't. I understand that, especially with bigger manufacturing facilities, it's hard to get away from it. But if you can, it's beneficial. And here's just a kind of a graphic table that shows you the triggers for major source. And this is in what you're seeing here is for attainment areas. So if you don't have any real heavy pollution issues, you're not in a very dense metropolitan area, which I think we have some non-attainment issues in the Cleveland area. I think for, what was it, Sarah? Was it PM10?
2.5 and lead, I do believe.
PM 2.5 and lead as well. So those, when you're in a non-attainment area, those numbers get ratcheted down, and you don't have, say for PM10, your threshold is 100 tons a year. In a non-attainment area, I believe it's half. It's like 50 tons. So, and again, everyone will get these. So here's how it breaks it down depending on the non-attainment status that you have. So you see how these numbers can be drastically reduced depending on what the ambient air quality indicates in that area for those pollutants. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about these. I'm hoping nobody on here has to deal with these. I don't like dealing with them. These are PSD, which is prevention of significant deterioration, and NNSR, which is non-attainment new source review. These are your really big emitters. A lot of power plants and things would fall under these. These are your biggest facilities. You're talking about extremely expensive to permit these facilities. Takes a long time. There's going to be public hearings. It really is a mess trying to get these, but these are, again, these are major sources with PTE greater than 100 tons per year for your listed source categories, and greater than 250 tons per year on your criteria pollutants for all others. So, and then the non-attainment new source review, it's required review for new major sources or major sources making major modifications in areas that exceed those NAC standards that I mentioned before, depending on what that pollutant might be. Again, these are, hopefully nobody's dealing with these. These are a real headache. So, and then there's some just identified categories down here that were mentioned up there. So if you have a steam powered electric plants, generation plant greater than 250 million BTU per hour, that's one of the categories. Refineries and chemical process plants are also included in that. And the greenhouse gases, that's something I didn't talk too much about. We do mention it in here. Greenhouse gas reporting is a relatively new thing to the air quality world, but they have a little different threshold here than they do in other places. So I listed that down there at the bottom as well. And here's just another graphical representation like the one for the Title V that kind of shows where your thresholds are for these. And I think that is about it for just kind of a general overview of the permits and what types of permits are out there and what types of permits you might need depending on location and emission levels and types of facilities. So might be a good place to kind of pause. Are there any questions, Pamela, or are we good?
I don't have a question right now, but
Okay.
let me look. Yep, I think you can continue.
Okay. Yeah, I think we have a small enough group where if one does pop up, yeah, just cut us off and we can jump in. So
Sounds good. We'll do.
I will continue to advance the slides, but I'll let Sarah take over now on the, I think we're on the application process. So go ahead, Sarah. I'll mute my mic.
Okay, you can go ahead to the next slide, Jim. All right, air permit applications for the state of Ohio. There's quite a bit that can go into these guys. Some of the basic things that you're going to need to include in an application when you're getting ready to submit to the state would be a project description, kind of a good outline of what you're planning to build and what the emissions units are going to do. This is also outlined in the process flow diagram, which is a graphic. Sometimes it's a map or schematics or a CAD drawing of how your process is going to run. And then the most important part of the application are the emission calculations. You can get some emission factors which we use in those calculations that'll give us a good idea of what emissions are coming from a source. Some of those places we find these emission factors are from, it's a document called AP42, and it's just a bunch of stack test data and emissions tests that have been conducted for a wide variety of similar sources, and they kind of take all of that emission data and compile it and come out with an aggregate that is a good representation of what would be emitted from a source. So that can be used in your calculations. Sometimes we use vendor information. So if you have an engine, it would be What is that manufacturer telling you that engine can put out power-wise, or how much material can be moved by a screener within an hour? So that can help. Also, we can use stack test data, which we get from Stack Test, which used to be Jim's wheelhouse for quite some time. He was out in the field doing those. So those definitely help with your calculations. Also, with the application, we'll need a map of your site. Where is it located? A lot of the time, we'll just get a pin on a Google map, and that's perfectly fine. Same thing with like a plot plan of where your emission units are going to be located. If you're putting in an asphalt plant, where's your asphalt plant going compared to the roadways and the piles? Or sometimes, again, schematics from CAD we see often to where, you know, new facilities are popping up, how they plan on laying things out. Sometimes we submit regulatory applicability if we are, especially with FEPDOs, it's a really good idea if you know in advance what regulations you may be looking at and concerned that you might be tripping and headed into Title V, and how you plan on limiting your emissions. So having a good idea of your regulatory applicability is always a good idea. And then emission category forms, which are EACs. You'll hear that an acronym a lot. It gives an idea of the process and what emissions are coming from that process specifically. And with big sources, every now and again, we'll need to submit backed analysis, which is a bear of a process, which is a top-down economical analysis of cost versus feasibility of control equipment. And most of the time, we'll see that on larger sources like Title V's and facilities that are subject to PSD and NNSR, which Jim mentioned earlier. Same thing with impact analysis. How is the new source going to affect the area that you're going to install it in? And emissions offsets. I'm not going to go into this too much because we could spend all day talking about emissions offsets. There's a banking system that Ohio EPA uses for the amount of pollution that can be emitted in an area. And if you're going to install a large source that might be adding a lot of pollution to a specific area, you'll need to purchase emission offsets from Ohio EPA's bank to kind of offset the amount of pollution that would be emitted geographically. And then emissions modeling is source specific, and it kind of gives an idea of the amount of pollution or emissions coming from your source. And we can do that a wide variety of areas. And sometimes we use programs called tanks to model tanks emissions, or we use Promax a lot in our office dealing with oil and gas, and that's a good way to model emissions as well.
Yeah, the emission offsets, unless you're, you know, if you're Title V or below, minor source or synthetic minor, you're not going to have to worry about emission offsets. That's really kind of your PSD level facilities that are dealing with all that stuff.
Okay, so the actual content that we look at in the application, we're going to start with our emission calculations. So when you submit calculations, we want to look at your absolute maximum emissions that you can put out from your facility, and that's what we call the potential to emit. So we will calculate that. What is the absolute worst things can look when you're operating at maximum capacity. And then we'll dial it back to kind of look at your actual emissions. So if you're not operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days, maybe you're only operating 5 days a week for 8 hours. So we'll be able to dial back your emissions based on how much you're operating. So your actual emissions can actually help quite a bit, especially if you're in need of the FEPDO permit. We can definitely use those to bring down your emissions. And then if you have a requested allowable, that would kind of be along the same lines to where you'd like to not use your potential to emit to establish your limits, but rather, look at your emissions based on what you're actually doing. These calculations are used to determine the type of permits. So like Jim said, if your emissions are calculated to be over 100 tons per year, then it looks like you're headed into Title V. And you can kind of work with the numbers a little bit or establish limits on site that would allow you to do your FEPDO. And then of course there's the true minor permits, which most facilities get, the true minor PTIOs. All of the calculations should include a summary table and then process specific calculations. So you want to do it per emissions unit as well. So you want to look at the source as a whole, look at all of the VOCs that a facility emits or all of the particulate, and then break it down by source too. And sometimes netting is required, but that's for really large sources. And again, that's a complicated process that usually we only worry about with PSD and NNSR. Always submit a sample to show how you're getting there. It helps the agency in their review. Sometimes, we'll send something over to the agency in Excel spreadsheet, maybe where we don't have, where you don't have your formulas in there. It can be hard for the agency to follow where you're getting your info from. So having a sample calculation to show how you got there is always helpful. And if you have any backup information such as engine info from the manufacturer, etc., that can always help with the permitting process. Okay, the Ohio EPA state-specific forms. Again, site information, and you'll need to also include a list of the employees that are responsible for the process. This would include somebody the agency can get in touch with on site and who is the owner of the facility, and then who's responsible for billing. You'll want to indicate all of that information as well. In the second part of the application is where you break down your facility per source, and this section is completed for each emissions unit. So if we take a paint manufacturing operation, for example, you might have more than one mixer that you're looking at, or at a concrete batch plant, you might be looking at the batch plant itself and the roadways and the pile. This section would be completed for each one of those sources. And it just kind of breaks down the operation and any control equipment and goes into a little bit more detail about the source emissions. If you do have control information, that is also included in this area. And as I noted before, those are those EAC forms. Those are on Ohio EPA's website, and they're actually broken down by source category. There are forms on there for tanks, for storage piles, for spray booths, for auto repair operations. They actually have them developed, and you just input your emission information into those forms. So that's kind of helpful because you know exactly what they're going to need to process the application. And again, we'll need the process flow diagram. How's this operating? Give us an idea of beginning to end, how things are going to move through your process. And then back when we talked about general permits, Jim had explained that to get a general permit, you kind of have to do this little check sheet of whether or not your source can comply with the permit that Ohio EPA has already written. So those are there as well, and those are the qualifying criteria documents. Those are only submitted for GPs, like I said, and it actually also takes the place of the calculations for general permits. So you fill out the qualifying criteria document instead of submitting calculations. And then any fees with the process or certifications are also submitted. All right, so these are some additional steps that might need to happen with the permitting process. Sometimes with large sources, you might have public notice. You always have a public notice for a new source, but public notices for large sources would be if there needs to be a public hearing, or if there's any time allotted for a response to comment on a permit. Those steps can take a little bit longer. Sometimes we have to allot for some agency review. Ohio EPA will sometimes get a permit all nice and pretty, and there could be some federal applicability, and that'll head over to US EPA for them to take a look at and comment on, and sometimes that can take a little bit, so we have to allot for that timing as well. Sometimes there's health effects screenings that need to be done. It's sometimes that can be done via modeling. That's through Promax or tanks, like I had mentioned earlier. So synthetic minor permits and Title V permits are both issued a draft period. Those are about 30 days, and that's for public comment, so that can take a little bit of time. And then if there needs to be a public hearing on a permit, that can, of course, eat up a little bit of time getting that scheduled and completed. Processing time usually depends on the state deadlines and the state workflow. Their workload can, be a little, they can fluctuate. So if they're heavy at one point in time, it could take a little while for them to get through a review of your permit. Go ahead, Jim. Okay, so once a permit is issued, you would have a chance to review your permit and make sure that you are comfortable with it and there's no changes if there was a draft permit. It'll also give you an idea of your compliance timeline, and it'll help update compliance programs. And then you'll also get a good idea of your monitoring, record keeping, and reporting requirements, so that you will be able to maintain compliance with the emissions limits and, of course, any reporting requirements established via your permit. And this will also help you with your ongoing compliance certs. Okay, so federal air regulations, we again could spend a significant amount of time on the federal air regs. This is just an idea of a very few of the federal air regulations that might apply to operations that I have had the privilege of working with or know to be pretty common in the Cuyahoga County, Cleveland area. So as you can see, there's quite a few.
Yeah, and as Sarah said, this is just a snapshot. There are a lot more out there. New source performance standards and niche apps. So.
Okay, I have a question here. If now is a good time to ask, is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, one of our attendees wants to know, where can they get more information about how to complete an air permit application? They're looking for a step-by-step process, if you can help with that.
You can contact your local air agency, and they can kind of give you an idea. I believe there are some, they have some mechanisms for kind of helping, say, small business owners and stuff work through that. I will say this, and I haven't been a consultant this time around for that long, so I'm not doing this in a self-serving way. You just have to be really careful. The air regs are so complicated. You almost have to be an environmental attorney to be able to understand and read them anymore. And one particular, your facility might be subject to 15 rules, and one of them has 80 pages in it. So unless it's hard for somebody that's not an air person to pretend to be an air person. So I'll just caution you by saying that. But you can contact your local agency if you have a pretty minor facility and it's maybe it's exempt or something like that. You might be able to kind of plow through it. But if you get into your synthetic minor and even minor source permitting, and definitely synthetic minor in Title V, you're probably going to need some help doing it.
Another question, for someone starting a new business, what's the first step in making sure they are getting the permits that they need?
I would suggest, again, sitting down with a consultant and discussing the plan. Once a consultant or somebody that's familiar with air quality understands the sources that you have and where you're trying to build them, and maybe get an idea of your production levels and things like that, then they can kind of start to formulate an opinion or a plan on what sort of permitting you may or may not need. So yeah, there is a good bit of planning that goes involved with this, and honestly, you're going to have an air permit is probably going to be one of the, if you need one, it's going to be one of the first things you have to get, because for the most part, you can't build anything that needs an air permit without having that air permit in hand.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay, so we'll start in on the state of Ohio air regulations. So the ORC became effective due to Senate Bill 265. This identifies the requirement for review of new and modified air sources with air toxic emissions. And the list of air toxic emissions can be found in the rule that's cited on the slide, OAC Rule 3745-11401. There are approximately 188 HAPs on the current list. It also will outline the requirements of a new or modified permit to install. Modeling is required to determine the potential impacts of any hazardous air pollutant. So you'll want to make sure you take a look and see if there is a pollutant on the list when you're getting ready to install a new source. Some of the exemptions from this rule are parking lot storage piles, storage tanks, any type of transfer operations, grain silos, and the list goes on, and it's all right there. Okay, so there is a rule that's called the de minimis rule, and this rule exempts very small sources of air emissions from the permitting process. The sources cannot emit more than 10 pounds per day of any air pollutant or 1 ton per year of a HAP. You'll find that really small sources such as small boilers, sometimes small engines can take advantage of the de minimis rule. And then, what we did was we kind of looked at 2 of the main rules that a lot of the sources in Cuyahoga County are going to fall under, and one of them is 1707, and this is for the control of visible particulate emissions. And then what I did was I kind of broke down the 2 different spots of 1707 that a lot of sources of particulate emissions are going to be subject to. One is 1707, and that's for any stack emissions. So that would be emissions from kilns, ovens, and engines. And then 1708B is for fugitive dust. So from things such as oven doors, windows, roadways, any type of material handling, crushing, sorting, and screening. 1708 is another common rule for particulate emissions, and this is for dust from processes. So we're going to be looking at material loading operations, and then it also contains limitations for baghouse outlet emissions. And then the next 2 are for 1710 is for fuel burning, so you're talking boilers. And 1711 would be also processes, so furnaces, engines, crushers, screeners, and conveyors. These are some other rules that could potentially apply to sources. So 1806 gives limits for fuel burning equipment, And then when you get into OAC Rule 374521, we're looking at organic compound emissions and volatile organic compound emissions. So this is going to be the rule where we're going to look at, it's a little bit more source specific as you get down into the rule. So 1707 kind of looks at emissions of OC from a wide variety of stationary sources, and 2109 does the same for volatile organic compound emissions. And then as you can see, as you look down the slide, it gets a little more source specific with 12 and 15 and 18 and 23 going into a little bit more of specific operations like the wood furniture manufacturing or to commercial bakeries and such. Okay, 3745-3103 is a little bit of a confusing rule. This has those small source exemptions that Jim had talked about in the beginning of our presentation, but it also contains the permit by rule regulations. So it can get a little bit confusing when it comes to the permit by rule, because permit by rules are actually a permit. They're not an exemption. They're just an exemption from actually having to do the long permit forms. But under 3103, you'll find those small source exemptions like small boilers or small roadways that might fall under this rule and would then allow a facility to not have to permit the source. And then 3105, which is BAT, this is where you're going to see a lot of the emission limits and permits come from. And then 77 is all of the Title V regulations. Those are the big facilities that Jim was talking about. So our the regulations for Ohio EPA for Title V facilities will come from there. And then you can find the list of air toxics in 114. Okay, now this is the compliance side of things. So obviously there's going to be periodic and annual requirements once you receive your permit. These are just a few of them. The GHG reports are due on March 31st of every year. So for your large sources of GHG emitters, your reports are usually due about March 31st or so. And then your annual emission reports are due on April 15th. And then same with toxic release inventories. Those are going to also be for larger sources. And those are on July 1st. Annual permit evaluation reports are for all of your smaller facilities, and those are a couple check marks, and they're due either there's one of 4 times throughout the year that you can select for your company to submit those. And deviation reports are required in case something happens where you have an upset at your facility that would cause a little bit of extra emissions, or control equipment goes down. You'd want to submit a deviation report to let the agency know what happened and then what you had done to remedy the situation. And then of course any emission testing would be identified in your permit as well. Some Title V permits that are subject to federal regs have a stack testing, recurring stack testing requirement in their permit.
And the PERs, there's a fee associated with the PERs, right, Sarah? Is there
I don't think so. Not with the PERs, with your annual emissions report.
Okay, the annual emissions report is the one where you pay the fees. So based on your tons of pollutants that you emit in Ohio, you will pay for those based on a fee schedule that comes out every year that determines how much you pay per ton. And then along with the deviation report, you could have the semi-annual deviation reports, as I mentioned earlier, for Title V, and you also have your annual compliance certification for your Title V permits as well. So there's a lot of stuff to do on the compliance side and the reporting side, and it's always one of the big hang-ups for people, the reporting part of it. So I think that about wraps it up. Here's our contact information again. You guys you'll get copies of all these slides. And if you have any questions now, we can answer them, or you can send them to me or to Sarah or both of us or to Pamela, and she can get them to us, or however the best way to do that is. But I would probably say plan ahead. If you're thinking about building something or modifying something, give yourself plenty of time. And yeah, try to stay out of Title V if you can, and try to keep things as low emitting as possible. And things have always been very complicated in the air world, and they seem to be getting more and more complicated as we go. So to save yourself time and money, try to get somebody on your team that knows not just a little bit, but knows a lot about air. It's not like, I would say it's not like dealing with permitting or compliance in another medium like soil or water or anything like that. Air is a different animal, and I think just about anybody will tell you that. So hopefully this helped and at least gave you a little snapshot into the air quality permitting and compliance world. Obviously, we could do an entire 8-hour course on this, and we do within the company. This is just to give you a little bit of an idea of what you might be up against if you're looking at permitting or modifying permits and things like that. So thanks, everybody.
Okay, great. Thank you both Jim and Sarah for sharing so much great information today and your insight with us. And thanks to all of you for participating in today's webinar. We hope you found this webinar engaging and informative. If you have thoughts to share, please let us know. For information about upcoming webinars, please visit gcpartnership.com/events. This concludes today's session. Thanks again.